Hello, everyone. Good morning from Colombia. I'm Richard McColl here in Bogota for Colombia Calling. We have Adriaan Alsema for Colombia Reports on the line, and also Joshua Collins from Pirate Wire Services on the line as well. We're going to be discussing today this ongoing diplomatic, well, more than diplomatic, spat between President Trump and, of course, President Petro here in Colombia. Adriaan.
Yeah, if you want to support either of us, you can support Richard on patreon.com/Colombia Calling. You can support Joshua on piratewireservices.com. And you can support my website, Colombia Reports, on patreon.com/Colombia Reports.
And so what we're going to discuss today, we're going to put some things into context. And it's great to have someone from the United States here as well, is going to know the ins and outs of what goes on, maybe not what goes through President Trump's head, but also to put it into context and so on. So who's going to start and say, where do we begin? Are we beginning with the bombing of alleged drug runners in the Caribbean? Are we talking about something else? I don't know. Adriaan or Joshua?
Well, let's start with the developments from yesterday. So governing via Twitter, or X, as Trump often does, he released a statement. Yeah, he released a statement calling Gustavo a illegal drug dealer and a terrorist who is wreaking death, destruction, and havoc on the United States through drugs. And then he threatened to revoke all foreign aid. His direct quote, in all capital letters, "These payments or any other form of payment or subsidies will no longer be made to Colombia," misspelled with a U. So that was like the immediate diplomatic flap, right? So a lot of people in Colombia are concerned about tariffs. Some important background is that Colombia was recently decertified by the Trump administration as a reliable partner in the U.S.-led war on drugs. And since then, throughout the day, there's been a series of diplomatic escalations. We just learned that Colombia recalled its ambassadors this morning, and there's been a lot of speculation, both within Colombia and internationally. I think the biggest concerns in Colombia are probably the tariffs, but a lot of people are also, this is rhetoric that sounds like what Trump has been saying about Maduro in recent months. Like, these are the justifications for bombing those boats. That has been a huge story for the last month and a half now. So, we can get into all the details, but that's the immediate context for what happened.
Yeah, and what I think is important to point out from like Petro's point of view is that he really doesn't care about U.S. aid anymore. The vast majority of financial aid from the United States was stopped with the cutting of U.S. aid already. So now I believe that since 2023, aid has been reduced from more than $700 million to $200,000 in 2025. So
it's really that small.
Yeah. So there's not like that much at stake for Petro, and what Petro said this morning is that he now actually has the opportunity to come with a counter-narcotics policy that actually works, rather than the notoriously ineffective war on drugs, which has killed a lot of people but has never reduced either drug consumption or drug production.
And we're right in saying that drug production is sky high, but then drug seizures are even higher as well. It's not as if drug seizures have stopped, right?
No, and well, actually, the drug production isn't necessarily sky high. So what Petro has been doing over the past 2 years, mainly in the last year, was step up the crop substitution program, which allows farmers to remove their coca crops. So that's the base ingredient of cocaine, and instead plant, for example, cocoa or whatever. Okay. And there's been a bit of a spat between Petro and the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime about how the cocaine production is measured. So Petro went on telly a few days ago to explain it. And what he said and showed was that the United Nations uses maps where coca cultivation takes place. And then based on those maps, they calculate how much cocaine is produced. Now, 2/3 of the territory used to calculate cocaine production hasn't been used for the production of coca in the last 3 years. So it's quite possible, and we don't know it yet, like these numbers are being revised by the United Nations and the Colombian government to find out like what the real potential cocaine production is. So the numbers that Trump has been using to base his decisions on are inaccurate, according to Petro.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Joshua, how do you feel about this as well? Is this something that, you know, I think, okay, we've got the figures. The figures are they're not correct, the ones that come through, or they can be debatable and so on. This cutting of assistance and aid and a potential slapping of tariffs, which is, you know, they're talking about today, tomorrow coming through. Do we think it's a strategic own goal for Trump really in this one? I mean, because he's undermining regional security.
It's interesting. I mean, Colombia has been the U.S.'s closest ally in Latin America since the beginning of the Cold War. So that's a really long relationship. They share intelligence. They do joint narco-trafficking operations. In the past, during the Civil War, they did joint military operations. So since January, this relationship has gone from very positive to shambles. And it's not just this event. I mean, Marco Rubio, before he even came to office, was calling Trump a terrorist and an agent of chaos. So he brought a lot of rancor with him into the administration. And Trump and Petro have been on and off feuding through public statements since Trump took office. And the relationship has just declined dramatically. And this just seems like the culmination of the decay of that relationship. It does seem like the U.S. has taken a very hands-on approach in Latin America. It's sort of back to the days of gunboat diplomacy, where they reward their allies and punish people that they don't like. And Trump, when he makes claims that Maduro is an illegitimate president, and I want to clarify that, of course, like that election was fraudulent. I'm not defending Maduro. But when he talks about how the Maduro regime commits human rights violations, which is true, but he's blowing up people in the boats, those are extrajudicial killings. It's the same thing that he's criticizing Maduro for. Bukele in El Salvador is another example of somebody that Trump sort of supports unconditionally, although he's clearly committing tons of human rights violations, according to Amnesty International, International Crisis Group. I mean, respected organizations and journalists in the country have well documented this. So it seems like the only common thread to Trump's foreign policy in Latin America is whether he likes the president or not, right? That's kind of what it all comes down to.
Yeah, and this is kind of where Petro gets triggered, because it's pretty evident that Trump hates communists and socialists, and he's just an old school Cold Warrior what that's concerned. And Petro, we gotta remember, he's like a former guerrilla. He loves socialism, and he's a proud socialist.
Yeah, he also loves poking the bear. I mean, he loves this. It's the great.
He loves tweeting. So it's a perfect thing for him.
Yeah. he loves showing that he can stand up to the great oppressor in the north, you know. So I think this tails in. I mean, Petro has, I mean, he's well within his rights to decry what's going on in the Caribbean and how it's being treated. I mean, let's be entirely honest. And that's really what is his complaints have been. It's like at this point in time, it's like, you know, treat us with some respect a little bit, don't you think?
Well, also, and I think Petro also like genuinely wants and needs like a proper counter-narcotics policy. Like Petro claims that the war on drugs has failed, and he's not the only one. Former President Juan Manuel Santos claimed the same. And I believe like anyone here in Colombia it's pretty common knowledge that the war on drugs and this repressive way of approaching drugs is absolutely useless. And it's a threat to Colombian national security. So you got guerrillas that are being financed by drugs. You got organized crime groups that are gigantic because of the illegal drug trade. And the United States, the world's largest cocaine consumer, because there's like 5 million consumers there approximately, won't cooperate with strategies that are widely considered more effective than, for example, destroying coca fields, which is what Trump has been pushing, and which is just a proven failure. There was one year, a few years ago, when President Ivan Duque was in office, that they said that they eradicated like 130,000 hectares of coca, and at the end of the year, like the coca cultivation only went down with 7,000 hectares.
And
so
it was still a record year of cocaine production for Colombia too, which is interesting.
Exactly. So in order to reduce like cocaine production, you need to eradicate so much coca. Like this would consume the entire Colombian police apparatus. And everybody understands that this is utterly stupid except Trump.
Yeah, I don't think that's a controversial claim. Another thing that maybe is interesting for people that aren't in Colombia is that coca leaf is an indigenous plant. It's used for ancestral medicines. It's like a really big part of indigenous cultures. If you go to Putumayo, like in the southwest of the country. And so, I mean, some armed groups do force these people, or they do it willingly for payment to sell that as coca paste to be processed into cocaine. But it's also a tradition that's thousands of years old that is just part of their culture. So, I mean, there's some carve-outs in Colombia about who's allowed and who's not to, but it's still, the coca leaf itself is still highly regulated by UNODC. And so there's just so many problems with focusing only on the coca production. It's just one of 1,000 different factors happening in Colombia.
Well, I would argue that there's no point in fighting cocaine production if there is not a concerted effort to reduce like drug consumption. If you look at the drug consumption in the United States, this is through the roof. Obviously, like because of fentanyl and not cocaine, but it's kind of weird to be blaming Colombia for what is like a public policy failure in the United States. Like without healthcare in the United States, you can't reduce drug consumption.
Even if you want to make a purely market-based, like capitalist arguments, like these guys are supposed to be fans of free markets, right? Like they're trying to only address the supply side. That's not how you, as long as there's demand, when you address the supply side, this is just economics 101. All that does is drive the price up, right? Like that's really all that it does. So it just makes no sense from a social angle, as you just explained. It makes no sense from an economic angle, and it makes no sense as a drug policy, like law enforcement angle. It's clearly ineffective. Like since the war on drugs has started, I don't have the exact numbers of how many people have died, but thousands directly, and probably thousands more indirectly due to conflict caused in Colombia.
Well, and Petro claims 1 million.
Yeah, Petro likes to exaggerate, but maybe let's say it's 1 million. But all of that blood, and for what? Consumption hasn't gone down. In fact, demand has only gone up.
I think, you know, the sacred leaf, of course, as you're saying, Joshua, it's millennial ancient medicine and so on. It's central to religions and society in places like Putumayo, and of course into Bolivia. We're going to see all sorts of things going on there now with the election of Rodrigo Paz. And of course, the US hasn't had any real diplomatic relations with Bolivia since 2008. So fascinating going on in that. But I also think, you know, the destruction of coca fields is so damaging, not only to Colombia's countryside, but to the small farmers who remain in these areas with absolutely zero state presence. These are the ones who are being punished for essentially what is the war on drugs. And you're getting displacement of traditional Afro-Colombian communities, indigenous communities, smallholders, and beyond. It goes so much further into the fabric of Colombian society. And then we have to face Truth Social tweets saying, unpopular president, the worst in the world, drug dealer, when he's just not. That's, I think.
No.
But what I want to jump onto, though, can we bat around a few of the statements that have come out from the social media communications from Secretary of War Hegseth and, of course, President Trump and so on. I mean, they talk about, I don't have the figure to hand, you guys do. Trump is constantly making the claim, is it 25 or 250,000 or 25,000 Americans a year are dying from drugs pushed into the country by Colombia? What is the figure? He said it another few days ago.
It changes. I saw, he just responds off the cuff a lot of times, but I saw a claim that it was something like 200 million, and I was like, your population's 300 million, man. So I don't put a lot of faith in his numbers. But yeah, his argument is that, he talks about fentanyl the most, but his argument is that fentanyl and cocaine are weapons of mass destruction, is the phrase he used a few weeks ago, on the U.S. population, which of course brings up some crazy historical parallels.
But the problem here, the conflict that arises, is that Petro wants like a certain counter-narcotics policy based on crop substitution. The Trump administration clearly wants to treat the drug trade as terrorism. So, speaking of Hegseth, he yesterday said that the ELN was something similar to Al Qaeda, and must be treated as such, suggesting that the United States government is willing to carry out drone strikes inside Colombia to attack so-called narco-terrorists. I need to stress that one of the victims of the extrajudicial executions in the Caribbean was a fisherman. The American military doesn't seem to be particularly precise in who they target. The racism in the decision making in the North is shocking.
This is what gets me, is what they said, they always say according to our intelligence and so on, but we're not getting any real proof of what's going on, and we're getting these optics of the blurry drone shot, the satellite image of this stuff. Pete Hegseth's 17th of October tweet or whatever it was, is at the direction of President Trump, the Department of War conducted a lethal kinetic strike on a vessel affiliated with the Ejército de Liberación Nacional, the ELN, a designated terrorist organization that was operating in the U.S. Southcom area responsibility. The vessel was known by our intelligence to be involved in illicit narcotics smuggling and was traveling along the route, blah, blah, blah. These cartels are the Al-Qaeda of the Western Hemisphere, using violence, murder, and terrorism to impose their will, threaten our national security, and poison our people. You see, if you repeat this long enough, the base are going to start repeating it in the US as well, and the figures. That's what worries me the most, is that we're going to get this all quoted back at us by people in the North, which it's just so faulty.
Because first of all, that vessel, which was visibly a semi-submergible, so this is not a fishing boat the ones they've been attacking in the Caribbean. Their intelligence is some kind of aircraft flying over the Pacific and seeing a semi-submergible, and the only use for those vessels are drug trafficking. So the claim that this was affiliated with the ELN is completely invented. The ELN is not involved in any maritime activity. So how they come up with this nonsense is totally unclear to me.
Sometimes I
it's
think,
the
go on.
same administration that claimed that the Tren de Aragua is like has cells in every country, every city in the United States, which is just a ridiculous claim for anybody who's been half paying attention to the way that. I mean, Richard, you and I were in Cucuta. What was that now? 7 years ago.
Yeah, a few years ago now.
Yeah, and like the Tren de Aragua was just arriving to Venezuela, and yes, they're a criminal group, and yes, they are international in the sense that they work along a lot of borders in Latin America, or they do some extortion in some cities. But to like even compare them to like Colombian narcos is just an absurd comparison. They're like a disorganized street gang, basically. They do mostly extortion rackets and small time micro trafficking. Yeah. So, but like the thing that worries me the most about these claims, though, is that these justifications are the legal argument the Trump administration is making to the U.S. Congress to justify these drone strikes, and eventually they, in their own words, targets within Venezuela. So they argue that Maduro controls the Tren de Aragua and is using them to invade and attack the United States via drug supply as well as via migration. That's the justification for the Alien Enemies Act. That's the legal smokescreen that he's given these attacks. I mean, I don't think it's very useful to argue about the nuts and bolts of legality under U.S. and international law, but I do think that it's important because it's the same things that he's accusing Petro of right now, yesterday and today, are the same reasons that he uses to justify these bombings and actually bombings within Venezuela. And so as you mentioned, we have no proof. So they can say this about anyone they want, right? Like there's no
precedent is dangerous. I mean, the precedent is so dangerous.
And I would like to point out something ironic. Like you were in Cucuta when the self-proclaimed president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, tried to enter Venezuela via Cucuta.
I was there when he entered. Yeah, they got pictures of him coming out with the Rastrojos.
And exactly that operation was carried out. That was coordinated with the American government and Colombian drug traffickers. So like it's kind of ironic that the American government is and always has been working with drug traffickers and then ends up
it's true, but I don't think that's very good evidence for that. So if you cross any trocha in Cucuta, like you're working with narco traffickers or you're working with BLM. There's no other option, especially in 2019. So I mean, I crossed that border before 2019, before the diplomatic situation got really crazy. So I mean, you could argue that I was working with narco traffickers in the ELN, right? But I'm not. That's just who controls the trochas. Sorry, to clarify for the listeners, the trochas are the informal smuggling paths. There's hundreds of them around Cucuta. It's a very porous border, and Cucuta was at that time a concentration for people leaving Venezuela, as well as smuggling going both ways. It's still a hub for smuggling. But you understand what I'm saying? The distinction I'm trying to make, though, like I don't think that that's really good evidence that Juan Guaido was ever at the CIA like that. I mean, I mean, he was. We know that.
But I think using that as a sort of flag is not strong. But I mean, that's the thing. And actually, moving from this, you mean, Joshua, you are the resident expert here on Venezuela and so on. What about these? What about the claims about the Cartel de los Soles controlling and Maduro being the chief of it and so on? I think we need to discuss that for our listeners here.
Okay, that's a really complicated question. I've seen some people say that like this cartel of the souls is a thing and it exists, and in a sense, it does. There is organized collaboration, especially between high-level military members within the Venezuelan government, but there's no name for it, right? Like this is just a name that like journalists made up, and then was sort of adopted by some lawmakers. There's no like organization really. It's much better to describe it as like sort of a systemic corruption, specifically within the military. And they're not actively moving the drugs. They're basically taking bribes to let them pass, right?
Looking the other way.
Yeah.
And this is not uniquely Venezuelan. You see the same level of corruption
and I think like the one last point though is that like to say that like Maduro is in charge of that is a nonsensical claim. Like Maduro is guilty of a lot of horrible human rights violations, extrajudicial killings, torture, arbitrary detention, widespread espionage on the population. There's a lot of things that guy can be criticized for. But to try to portray him as being like a cartel, like the mob boss of the way that it works, that's not really true. Like most of the actors are actually probably Colombian, right? And ELN is a part of that, yes, but so are all the organized narcos, and those guys have way more logistical capabilities than ELN does. Those are the guys running the narco subs. Those are the guys sending airplanes. Those are the guys packing shipping containers. Like you might get some small time guys doing like little runs up north to Trinidad or to Panama, but as far as like the percentage is tiny. Like the organized logistical operation has nothing to do with Maduro.
This is a good moment to talk about some percentages quickly. When we were told that, the US is being flooded with drugs from Colombia and so on, what is the percentage? I think you've got the figures there, Joshua, of, cocaine leaving Venezuela or the Colombian Caribbean and the Colombian Pacific. Let's just get that out there, because I know that, the Trump claim is that everything pretty much is coming through the Caribbean. But I mean, the Pacific, as far as I know, is the number one sort of port of exit.
There it is. All right, that's a map from the UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. So those are the principal sea routes. As you can see, Venezuela has very few. This is just, it goes to North America. This is not including European markets. So you can see that the main routes are on the Pacific side, on the western side, and the vast majority are coming from Ecuador and Colombia, and Peru is third. As those are all coca. Well, Ecuador is not a coca producing company in a meaningful sense, but it is a huge transit country. So the UNODC estimates that 87% of the cocaine in the US comes from Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. And a couple different estimates, depending on the methodology used from Venezuela, but it's between 5 and 8%.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's good to get these out. And quickly, Adriaan, I think we know that fentanyl, which is obviously always accused of, Colombia and Venezuela are now being accused of producing and sending fentanyl to the US. It's not produced down here.
No, and it's not trafficked here either. So that entire claim is, it's just not based on any evidence. Like there's no evidence that there is fentanyl in Colombia or that it goes through Colombian ports. So this is, they are just creating a fictitious national security threat, in my opinion, just to because they want to sort of like impose themselves as like the hegemonic power in the region, like the old empire that they were, and that's not really happening. It might be a good moment to switch to the soft power. Well, yeah, the soft power used by the United States at the moment. So the President Trump threatened to impose sanctions on Colombia, like impose tariffs, I mean, which he did in Brazil earlier as well, which totally backfired because the whole Brazilian population turned anti-American and rallied behind Lula. And this is something, if you look at social media in Colombia, this type of threat doesn't really concern people, because a lot of people have nothing to do with exports to the United States. And this is partly because there has been a diversification of trade, although this is very much still like a baby trade. But the export to the United States is mainly oil and other fossil fuels, and they employ very few people. If you look at the flower sector, that's only like a noticeable export commodity in the week before Valentine's Day in February. So and it's kind of interesting how you see that like the elite is really concerned about this, because it's mainly like a very small margin of society, like a real elite clique of compradors that are making money with exports and imports and whatnot. But the general population just doesn't care about it. It is more, I believe it's quite likely that this clash between Trump and Petro could really benefit the left in Colombia in the coming year. Like, we got elections coming up in March and in May, if I'm correct, next year. And I believe that Trump is not doing himself a favor.
I want to jump in. That I think it's the possibility of what are they calling it in the press, the anti-Trump bump. And I think there is thing. I think it could consolidate popular opinion against it, and not just within Colombia. I mean, I think regionally it's a thing, and it'll be interesting to see how this pans out very soon. For example, Latin America is pretty. The word is solidarity, isn't it? Latin America gets together in solidarity. It's of the people, not maybe the politicians and so on. It'd be interesting to see how this pans out with regards to Argentina, of course, with Milei being the Trump's best buddy, and the congressional midterm elections coming up there, and the 20 billion. Yes, they will give. No, they won't give aid from Trump. If you don't win, Trump seems to think it's a presidential election. But it would be very interesting, because you have a lot of the population on the ground looking around as well, when they, saying, but look what Trump's doing. And when you're thinking about the sort of the elites and the upper echelons of Colombian society and their fear, I mean, I do read opinion articles written by many of them, the leaders of the Andy and the Colombian, Colombo-American, whatever they call it, Chamber of Commerce. And I read one by the former Vice President Marta Lucia Ramirez today, of course, Vice President to Ivan Duque, and it's this absolute fear of, Petro is doing this, and he's ruining that, and he's ruining that, and ruining this, and we can't do this, and he supports Maduro. And it's like, actually, well, no. And also, you sort of say, Petro doesn't support Maduro. He would like it, through the appropriate channels, a change. We need a good neighbor. And also, when you also say the thing, there's this surety within the opposition, especially the top-ranking ones, that Trump is going to support them if they get in power. There's no assurance of this at all. Trump changes on a dime. If you even look at him the wrong way, he's a nasty person. He'll then slap tariffs on again. It was not, Duque thought that he could sort of cozy up to Trump in the first term. Nothing really came of that at all. It was that's what I sort of think you need to get out there. It's like, just let's say if the opposition get in 2026, it's not a sure thing that Trump's going to be your best buddy. He may say it on the outset, but it's not a sure thing. Josh? I
think I've been really surprised by how much influence the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has had on foreign policy, because in the the first administration of Trump, aside from Venezuela, which of course he loves threatening Venezuela, but aside from that, Latin America was largely ignored by the Trump administration. There were half of the countries never even got ambassadors appointed to them, right? Like, it was just across the board, like, disengagement. But this administration has been a lot different. And I think my theory about how this works is that those guys in the Colombian elite that you talk about, they know that Marco Rubio will support them. And I don't think Trump really cares about most countries. Like, if he probably doesn't even know who the presidents of half of the countries in Latin America are. And he cares about, like, the big ones, right? He cares about Mexico. He cares about Venezuela. And I guess he likes Argentina and El Salvador because the presidents worship him, right? So that's like one of his qualifications for making friends with him, I guess. But I don't think he cares. So Rubio has a lot of power that I really didn't expect, because he's the one setting the terms and the policy and the tone in all those countries that Trump doesn't care about. And I think that Colombia is kind of like in the middle there somewhere. Like, obviously, Trump likes to fight with Petro, but I don't think it's like a priority when he's thinking about his foreign policy. Whereas for Marco Rubio, it clearly is. I mean, it's impossible not to read this as an attempt to influence upcoming elections, right? The decertification, where they called Petro unstable and how the left had ruined Colombia. And now these new statements that he's a drug dealer and that then, I mean, they're all but saying like, we want to get our guy in there, right? Like you don't have to read much between the lines. This is a very, like I was saying earlier, it's like a very aggressive, like throwback to like 20th century diplomacy in Latin America. So those guys that you're reading those op-eds from, I think that they can count on his support, but not because Trump is trustworthy, but because Marco Rubio's contacts in Miami are the same contacts they have in Miami. They all know each other. They've all met. They probably occasionally have meetings to like get on the same messaging and the same bullet points and stuff like that. And I think that they're confident in that relationship.
And to what extent is the concerns that these crowds in Miami have, to what extent are they shared by the general American population?
They're not. So this is really interesting because a lot of that lobby pushed for Trump's election, thinking that he was going to put pressure on Maduro, and they're right about that. But Venezuelans are a tiny, tiny part of even the U.S. migrant population. So it's Mexico by far, and then Guatemala, and then Panama, I believe, and then Colombia. Venezuela is like number 20 or something, right? So like they don't have a base of support really in the United States. What they do have though is deep contacts with like the elites in Latin America, and that is influential for people like Rubio, who is a Florida. He came from Florida. That's the political background he came up in. Those are his contacts. And right now, through him, I do feel like that lobby is wielding some outsized influence, for good or for bad. I don't know. But yeah, that's the answer. But generally, population, no, not at all. And you even see Venezuelans in the U.S. that are highly critical of his migration policy. They're highly critical of what ICE is doing in these roundups and canceling the temporary protected status a few weeks ago.
So where do we go from here? The spat will continue. We won't know what exactly it's going to continue. Of course it will. Rubio is clearly pushing for regime change in Venezuela. He's convinced
the Colombian elite is really trying hard to prevent any tariffs being imposed, and are also trying to maintain the aid coming from the United States, because like this is also a sector of the population that needs this financial aid from the United States to maintain their relevance in Colombian politics.
Since we brought up Rubio, I think it's also interesting that as of, what time is it right now? 9:30. Yeah, 9:52 on Monday in Colombia. Marco Rubio still hasn't commented on these threats about the tariffs. Like he's been very, very vocal almost immediately every time that there has been a flare-up between Trump and Petro in the past. This is the only time where he still hasn't made even a statement about this. I think that there's some work going on behind the scenes. I think that like the elites are all talking behind the scenes, trying to figure out a way to get Trump to walk this back, because it's clearly a huge issue for them, way more than the general population in Colombia. And I think, this is just my theory, but I think that Rubio was taken by surprise by this, and that's why you haven't seen a statement from him yet.
Interesting. So if we'd asked you, again, moving on, if we'd asked you a month ago, would you have said there will be a tax on Venezuela? And if we asked you today, would you say there's a tax on Venezuela in the future?
If you'd asked me like 6 weeks ago, it would be better, probably before these boat strikes started, I would have said absolutely not. It's impossible. I thought it was all just a big show. Now I'm not sure. I don't have, I think that there's a real possibility. I think admitting that and being honest, I would be dishonest to try and argue that's not the case.
Adriaan?
I don't know anything about Venezuela. What I think about Colombia is that we are going to have a lot of pressure coming from the United States in the run-up to the elections. That there's going to be a lot of meddling from the Trump administration, and there's going to be a lot of like agitation coming from particularly from the far right here in Colombia.
Yeah, I've got an interview coming out shortly on the other podcast I run, and with an academic from the War College in the US who says by the end of November, beginning of December, there'll be missile strikes on strategic kinetic targets within Venezuela. Just wait for hurricane season to ebb, and it will happen. So, I mean, fascinating, if not very concerning. Yes, you're right, Adriaan. There will be meddling anyway, any which way, I think, towards Colombia's elections. Joshua, do you have any final comments?
I guess that I just wanted to clarify maybe that I see like strikes within Venezuela as a possibility. I think it would be irresponsible not to say that that's not a possibility at this point. I mean, the Trump's administration's own words, they've said they're pushing for that. But I still strongly believe we're not going to see anything like an invasion. Like I've seen some people that are really pro-intervention, like arguing, sort of cheering on this idea that like Marines are going to arrive in Venezuela. And just logistically, that's impossible. It's not going to happen. 65,000 U.S. troops couldn't control Afghanistan, and Venezuela is bigger, and it has huge regions of jungle, and ELN is there. ELN would love to spend some time with American soldiers. These are all reasons why this is like not going to happen.
To spend some time is a nice way of putting it. It's like show their expertise and know-how. Shall we wind this down then, guys?
Yeah. So if you wanna support us, please do. We always need money.
Yes.
you can support Richard on patreon.com/Colombia Calling. You can support Joshua on piratewireservices.com, and you can support me, my website Colombia Reports, on patreon.com/Colombia Reports.
So thank you from you all for listening. I've had a lot of questions, even in the last few hours, about what's going on. So I've been Richard McColl in Bogota. There's Adriaan Alsema, Colombia Reports, and Joshua Collins for Pirate Wire Services there in Medellin. Hopefully, we've raised a few questions and answered a few questions here for you guys. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Adriaan.
Bye.